Hello and welcome to a new venture for the CIOT and ATT. We're doing a series of interviews, talks, perhaps best termed reflections. I'm John Whiting, formerly Tax Policy Director here at CIOT ATT and indeed a long time ago President of CIOT. And joining me on this series will be people from, well, a variety of backgrounds, but with one thing in common. And that is that they've had a long career in taxation, and we think it's interesting to ask them to look back on aspects of it. So joining me today is, well, it's trite to say, but somebody particularly for ATT members who needs no introduction, and that is John Kimmer. John, come on John, you wrote the book, didn't you? One-time president of the association, indeed involved, I think, in founding the association.
Not quite, but very early on I went onto the council in 1990 and the association was formed in 1989.
Right.
So a long time ago.
A long time ago, and of course a long time with the Institute, but latterly you almost invented the association's technical committee, and then just to make sure they were doing it right became the association's first technical officer.
That's right. One of my goals when I became president was actually to work with HMRC, or the Inland Revenue as it was in those days, to try and improve the system and set up the technical committee, which made many submissions to the Inland Revenue in those early days on some varied topics, but a lot of it was in relation to self-assessment, which was very new when I became president in 1999.
Okay, well, forgive me, but that's recent history, John, and what I'm going to ask you to do is go back a bit, because you've been in tax for quite a few years, and of course started out with it was still the Inland Revenue, I think, in those days. So why and when did you actually join?
Well, we've only just passed my anniversary of walking across the threshold of Worthing 2 district in August 1960, so I've just completed 54 years working in tax. A very different animal compared to HMRC today, and it was one of those things where looking for a job after school, applied to the civil service. You get a huge list of possible departments, none of which at my age meant a great deal to me. I picked out the Inland Revenue as I'd heard of that and thought it might be interesting. And then you had to decide whether you wanted to be a TO, a VO, or an AC, which again was a bit sort of code wordy at that time, but
TO,
tax officer.
T officer?
Tax officer, no, not a T officer. Verification officer and assistant collector. And I chose being a tax officer and joined the Inland Revenue and started to learn about tax.
So, John, you've explained why you joined the then Inland Revenue, but when you first arrived, your first day, first weeks, I mean, what did you find? Lots of training, lots of induction, or was it all on the job?
Well, no, it was a bit of both. I mean, I was pretty green behind the ears when I went in, didn't know anything, but you were very soon trained from the bottom upwards across the spectrum of tax. So, you know, one of the first things you learnt was what they called movements, which was people moving jobs, how the P45 procedure worked and so on. So you got in at the bottom end, and then you had training courses. We used to go away for a week at a time, actually up to London B Training Centre in Honeypot Lane, Stanmore. And you had a whole week of lectures and tests and so on, and then when you went back to the district you continued working, but you also did exercises back in the district marked by a senior officer just to see you were progressing, and as a TO you had 4 of these spread apart by about 6 to 8 months each time, and you were thoroughly trained up to a particular level at that stage, and then as you got promoted, as I did, to tax officer higher grade, you then moved up a level and you were trained right across the board there, again back at London B Training Centre, and with exercises, and it was at that time that you began to wonder whether being in the Inland Revenue was actually the best place to be, with the promotional stages long apart, and that made me yearn to go out and look out into the profession.
Before we look at that, let's just say a bit more about, well, what was the Inland Revenue like to work in? Right? What were working conditions like? Because, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things that people will recognise, such as, let's be honest, good training, P45s I heard in there.
Yes.
But what were working conditions like? I mean, people no doubt have the vision that in those days you were sat at high desks with quill pens, but surely not.
No, you had desks, but they had a stand on them which was quite high, on which you had various things, and you had a block of forms, because everything was manual. You wrote everything out, particularly as a tax officer. You had very little typing done for you. Everything was done manually. We didn't even have electronic calculators. Photocopying was quite different to what it is today. I mean, the modern machine can do all sorts of things, double-sided, colour, back to front, and so on. It was an art in those days. Only one person in the district was allowed to take the documents for copying, and they went away and they did them, and if you wanted 2 copies, you got a black on white and a white on black, and it went through fluid as well. So it was really quite difficult, or quite different rather. Yes, but you understood what you were doing.
So it really was a good grounding in tax.
It was a fantastic grounding in tax.
And so, you know, you as a tax officer and later tax officer higher grade, you're dealing, I guess, mostly with individuals, personal tax. So
Yeah.
can you talk, I mean, we're all living in an era of self-assessment now. So how were the assessments done now? You know, how was somebody's tax agreed in those days?
Well, we were responsible as tax officers, and we had an allocation of somewhere around 5,000 taxpayers. So we would start the year by doing their coding, work out their code numbers.
Mm-hmm.
They would go out, we would deal with any correspondence, telephone calls, or meetings, because districts in those days, you dialed straight in, you had a counter, people would come into the counter, you'd see them there. And then you were responsible after the end of the year for reviewing the tax deduction cards originally, to make certain that the right code number had been operated, the right tax had been deducted, and if not, then you would make an assessment, which was called a P70, again all written out by hand, and dispatched, and they had a formal appeal period, unlike the P800s today, which are not considered to be assessments and therefore not appealable.
Right.
But that's another story which we might touch on later.
But how long did it take to actually finalise Mr. Smith's tax affairs so that he, or, and of course it would have been he still, it certainly you wouldn't have been dealing with Mrs. Smith, how long before they were signed off, as it were?
Well, after the end of the tax year, the deduction cards started coming in, great boxes from large employers and small packets from smaller employers. And then as the allocation holder, you had to compare the deduction card with what we had as a control card, a con card, for each individual taxpayer. And you would go through and you would check that the code number was right compared to what we knew we'd issued. You would enter the details of the pay and the tax on the con card, and then you had 4 methods of clearing the position for that particular year. If there was no net liability to tax, so they were NNL as we used to say, you could clear it as an N. If that happened to be a subsource and they had another source which was, as we called, the General Claims District, GCD, you would transfer the details to the GCD and you cleared it T. If everything appeared to be in order, the right code number, everything looked to be okay, you would Z the year. And then if there was something wrong and you needed to make an assessment, you would mark an A and you would write out a P70, which was carbonated, and we had one on our file, one went in the assessment book, and one went out to the taxpayer. And then if there was an underpayment, you would mark that on the con card for coding out in the subsequent year. Of course, if there was a repayment, then it would go out for repayment.
And all fairly prompt and easy. Now, in amongst this, John, I mean, you've already alluded to the fact at some stage you decided to move into the profession, but just before we get to that, what contact was there with agents? You know, had you come across these strange beasts?
Oh, most certainly. A lot of people had agents, and you soon got to know the agents in your local area. There were the good agents, and you could trust what they sent in, and there were the not so good agents that you probably looked through a bit more carefully.
And presumably you came across some who you thought were good, and you decided this would be a good move for you.
Well,
so why did you leave?
It's relatively simple to think why I left. In Worthing 2 district, having come back as a TOHG, there were 9 of us at that level in the district. 3 of us were in our early 20s, and the rest were probably over 50 or even over 55. And what we used to find was that they suffered a little bit of sickness. They had twice as much holiday due to them as we did. They were probably earning twice as much, and we were forever digging them out and not getting what I perceived to be a reasonable reward for the efforts that we put in. And I thought, well, I need to go somewhere where effort is rewarded, and that's why I started looking at job opportunities outside in the profession.
And you joined a firm, and then I know much later set up your own practice.
Yes, I joined a firm that was originally called Thornton Baker and Co. When I joined it. The and Co. disappeared very quickly, and of course it's changed its name to Grant Thornton since. So I was with them for some 13 years in Worthing, and as a result of leaving or the Inland Revenue, I decided I needed to get professional qualifications, which is when I started on the ATI exams, as they were in those days. And then having got that qualification, decided, well, let's go for the fellowship as well. So took the fellowship exam in '74, and that's when I became a fellow of the then Institute, now Chartered Institute of Taxation.
And of course, as I said, then at one stage set up your own firm. But having gone right back into history, John, what I'd like to do now is if we just sort of do a bit of reflecting, because you've been a practitioner for so many years, and of course latterly seen it from the point of view of the professional body. So comparing today's revenue with the one you first worked in, procedures now versus procedures then, how do you see it?
There is a completely different approach within HMRC, an approach which I don't think is better than what we had. We've lost the districts, we've got these massive conglomerations of offices. There's no direct contact with the person doing the job. I don't think the training now is as good as we got. We were trained across the board. They now appear to be trained in silos. And if something just drifts off to the side, they don't know, and they can't find it on the machine. I mean, they're mainly trained to input into the computer, and the computer does everything. But unfortunately, the old expression garbage in and garbage out, if they can't understand it, they don't understand when it comes out as garbage. Whereas in the old days, you know, you got a silly answer, you knew it was a silly answer, and you would go back and find out where it had gone wrong. So it's the approach is taking advantage of stuff, the computer systems, which we didn't have. But the people aren't trained enough to know how things really work. And as a result, we often get very silly answers back. I'll give you one slightly amusing, but you can understand it. You will be well aware of the 64/8s, which give authority. And one was returned to somebody saying, I can't process this because you haven't given me the national insurance number. And the 64/8 related to a company, which of course does not have a national insurance number. But you can hear the trainer saying, you can't process a 64/8 without the national insurance number.
I mean, in thinking back to the person you were then, to the sort of people you come across in the revenue, I mean, do you still see yourself in those people today, or are we talking different people, different attitudes?
I think the sort of people that I have been meeting latterly in my roles for ATT and as technical officer, They clearly want the system to work. I think their problem is that convincing the powers that be that changes should be made to make the system work better is proving far more difficult than I ever thought it would be. One of the things to which I alluded earlier was extra statutory concession A19, regulation 72. I have been meeting with HMRC on those matters for years, and we did seem to have a good rapport and a good new process coming through before I retired from as technical officer from ATT at the end of March. But it's still not there. And even though I have actually since had correspondence with the lady in charge of it, she apologised for the fact it's just taking ages to get it through. And to me, it seems silly that we've got improvements that could make the system work better, but someone somewhere is not prepared to put them in place.
Do you think it's a question of, I mean, you paint a picture when you were in Worthington of somebody doing his area and I guess taking responsibility for it there. Is the difference now that the average revenue person just doesn't have that responsibility that you once had?
They don't. I mean, it is very clear that there are occasions when you can see a reply come back which is really just how can I get this off my desk, because the buck does not stop there. When the response goes back, somebody else gets it. It was our responsibility. Our taxpayers were our responsibility, and if we didn't do it properly, then we were the ones that were carrying the can. And yes, we had people that we could go to for advice, but we had to get it sorted. Whereas today, they don't. They have to get rid of it.
And if we've talked about the people and the working conditions, I suppose the last thing I have to ask you about is the tax system. Now that's something that's just changed a tad since you started.
It has changed a huge amount. It's quite interesting that in the days when I first started, we had huge numbers of different allowances. I mean, personal allowance, you could have a single person's, a married person's, wife's earned income allowance, and we've alluded to that, dependent relative, housekeeper allowance, daughter's services, a multiplicity of allowances, and in fact more rates of tax. When I first started, we had 1 and 9pence. I'm back in real money, pounds, shillings and pence. 1 and 9pence, 4 and 3pence, 6 and 3pence, 7 and 9pence. And income tax stopped at that point, but there was something called surtax, which people paid when they had high incomes, and they paid that in addition to their income tax. But that was abolished many moons ago, and we then had rates as high as 98%, if I remember correctly.
So in one sense the system's got simpler.
But in other senses it's got a lot more complicated. Yes.
And we all know what's happened to the legislation, but final reflection, if I can ask you, John, you're looking back on a long career, and I know you've got many years before you as well, but any regrets?
No, it has been a good career. Tax is interesting. Tax is never the same as it was last year. You've got to maintain and build on your knowledge. But it's far more interesting than ticking the books for an audit or something like that. So I think the tax is a much more exciting world than auditing, and I have no regrets. It's earned me a living, and I hope that over the last few years in particular, I have put back some wisdom and hopefully some advice to make it better for others going forward.
I think that can certainly be the case, and well said that you certainly have put a lot back. And John Kimmer, thank you very much for sharing some of your reflections with us today.
Thank you, John. Nice to have the opportunity.